Well, I think the benefit of diversity is that it's diversity in everything, not only the population, but the businesses that are in a neighborhood. Yes, you can come to the Hawthorne neighborhood and you can eat burgers and American food at Working Man's Friend, and you can eat authentic Mexican food from the taco trucks or from La Posada. And I think there is a lot of beauty and a lot of positivity in the diversity that has happened here.
You know, there's something for everybody, and there's so much diversity here. It's very rich. Hawthorne really sets a great example for a community that you'd want to be in.
El pueblo cuida el pueblo, which means people of the neighborhood will provide for the people of the neighborhood. And so that, I think, is what makes a good neighbor, like our ability to build connection and reliability to one another.
That's our hope, is just like find ways to connect more with neighbors and engage with the businesses so we can create more of a community.
You know, I love to see the kids out playing, riding their bikes, playing with the other kids on their street, because that's really what the neighborhood is about.
When families see other families in the community, we respect that and we honor that.
I think it's important for people to understand the history of where they are living. Otherwise, they will judge where they're living according to what they're seeing around them without any understanding of where that comes from.
In 1821, when the city was being laid out, people first started to move across the river.
And at that time, the old National Road is what is today Washington Street. And traffic began to move west, covered wagons.
In 1838, Mount Jackson was established. It was the first organized and developed neighborhood and community west of White River.
But it was then just a small village. All around them was farmland. By the time you get to the late 1800s, there are like 8 railroads that are descending on Indianapolis, coming from all kinds of directions. And it was a major hub. And the increase in population put pressure on this farmland to be developed and used. Hawthorne essentially grew up in a cow pasture, if you want to put it that way. It was open farmland that had not been developed. It was owned by the Warmans. And so it was like in 1905, 6, and 7 that they literally divided up that farmland and began selling lots. And so things happened really quickly.
And a lot of German and Irish immigrants moved up to this community from Kentucky and Tennessee and from the South. What are the things that these people need? They need a place to worship. They need businesses, schools.
So you now have Catholic and you have 2 Protestant and very quickly a couple more Protestant smaller churches. In fact, the first name of this area that is now emerging was called West Park. The first church in Hawthorne was West Park Church. And they started out in Mount Jackson in an old church. The name Hawthorne does not emerge until later in the 1920s and even in the 1930s. Reverend Baker is absolutely key to the emergence of Hawthorne as a neighborhood and as a community. He came in 1915 and he hit the ground running.
Pastor Baker came into this community and he had a vision. In fact, he pioneered the effort of pastoring this church here.
And he quickly made contact with leaders in the churches and in the businesses. And out of that group of folk became the first board of West Park Social Services.
He wanted Hawthorne to be the fence at the top of the hill rather than the ambulance at the bottom. In the beginning, it was just more or less a gathering place. He was an advocate for meeting people's needs and really was responsible for getting not only Hawthorne Community Center started, but Washington High School, Nathaniel Hawthorne School 50, getting the Carnegie Library established in the Hawthorne neighborhood, and the creation of the West Side Messenger, which was the first newspaper on the West Side.
the paper flourished and it grew very fast. What he said you have to do, you have to unify the community, and the community needs to be in touch with each other and know what the rest of the community is doing.
He was uniting the social sector, the religious sector, family base. He was bringing everybody together. So Reverend Baker was up against some challenges. I mean, one of the biggest challenges that he was up against was KKK presence in this community.
There was an initial wave, and some people bought onto it and picked up a little bit, but there was a second wave that came in from the South. It became extremely popular in Indianapolis and throughout the state. The Klan was putting out a newspaper, the Fiery Cross, and it was published right in the heart of Hawthorne, not that far from Baker's house.
And he was very outspoken about his stance against the KKK behaviors, their social ideology. And so he took a stand through his writing on the West Side Messenger.
And you understand how complex feelings were in the neighborhood and how mixed they could be.
So the doors are about to be open for the community center. There's about 600 people that are gathered at the Hawthorne Community Center. Before everything was said and done, the KKK spokesperson went up to Baker and offered to pay a substantial contribution to cover the cost for the Hawthorne Community Center. But Baker was like, nah, we ain't doing that. And so as a result, the KKK, they threw up a sign, and about 300 of 600 people got up and walked out on him.
They were afraid that the center would suffer and that some of the other initiatives would suffer. And they didn't, put quite simply.
When he was asked about this later on down the road, he said that the community center is committed to making sure that there's racial and religious liberty right here in this community.
Hawthorne community, especially in its earlier decades, was really a blue-collar, working-class community. It wasn't rich, and they weren't poor.
Everybody was pretty much in the same range financially. So it's not snobbish, nobody was snobbish. I would say the heritage of most of the neighborhood was, English, Irish, German, but we did have the Phrygies, which were a large Syrian family. We just could walk out of our house and go over to our friend's house or go over to Hawthorne or, go to school or the park. We had a lot of freedom and independence.
I went to Hawthorne quite regularly. I was involved in the dance program, and it was the focal point of a lot of activities in the neighborhood.
It was all a very nuclear neighborhood. People worked in the neighborhood. People went to school in their neighborhood. They went to church in their neighborhood. There was a thriving Washington Street corridor, drugstores, shoe repair, beauty shops, restaurants, hardware stores. Any business that you could possibly want was located along that Washington Street.
My mom worked right here. It was a Hendrickson's, which was an insurance agency. There was a doctor's office right down on Washington Street. This here was Huddleston's restaurant, which a lot of people went there. Everybody was, excited to go to Washington High School.
That's where we met everybody from the other neighborhoods.
So my first experience with racial integration was at Washington High School. And the sports brought everybody together because it was a shared experience. We won a lot of state championships in basketball, football, track, wrestling. And it gave you a sense of pride to be from Washington High School. It did.
Hawthorne was not unlike many other urban neighborhoods that went through decline and blight, where people started to move out, and it did not happen overnight. It was like, okay, well, we'll close the schools. 5 years later, businesses will start to close, and 5 years later, churches will close. So it was a process that took several years. You just felt like nobody cared. It was not a happy time in this neighborhood, but there were people who stayed and who fought and who protested and who did what they could to continue to make the neighborhood a great place. Hawthorne was about the only thing that remained in the neighborhood as kind of that beacon of hope. My mother worked here for 25 years, was director for probably the last 12 of those years, and she retired in 1986, and that's when I became director. I've always kind of felt to continue her legacy, and not only her legacy, but Reverend Baker's legacy. You know, I knew that history was important, and I wanted Hawthorne to continue to be what Reverend Baker wanted Hawthorne to be for this neighborhood.
My parents found a sense of community here. They moved over here. There's 7 of us children, and there was something for each of us. This was a place not just for us as a group, but all 7 of us felt a sense of community here. We built our friendships here, different bonds, and Hawthorne just became our home. The community center was essential because that is where we built those bonds, dancing beside our friends in dance class, creating artwork in ceramics class, and playing beside one another year after year in basketball. You know, we became friends. We would compete with one another, but we also encouraged each other, and we grew up with one another. It was awesome. And those same bonds exist today because of Hawthorne.
Around the 2000s, when we had the growing Latino population, those businesses started to open up again, painted them bright colors and put signage in Spanish, or if it was a restaurant, the menus were in Spanish. There was a fear that I can't go in that store, that grocery store, and buy a gallon of milk because, you know, I can't speak their language and they won't understand me. And so we worked really hard to try to encourage people who lived in the neighborhood, because it's important that people support the businesses in their own community and that their dollars are going to support businesses. Many of those business owners and their families lived in this neighborhood, so we really were supporting the people who live in our neighborhood with our dollars.
So once we moved to this area, there wasn't enough Latino community in this area to have Mass at St. Anthony. The priest would take us to what used to be All Saints. Eventually it became overcrowded, and then we were able to have Mass on Sundays at St. Anthony, and now there's Mass all the time in Spanish. There's several Masses, and I think probably at the beginning there was a large portion of the Latino community at St. Anthony that was Mexican, but throughout the years it has really diversified. There's a large Dominican Republic community. There's a lot of people from Central America. And that's what's fun about the diversity at St. Anthony, is that when they have the festival, all of those different cultures are reflected in the food. So you can find tamales, you can find arepas, you can find pupusas, and there's a lot of food. I also grew up doing different community events during our neighborhood cleanup with Hawthorne Community Center. I got to be a part of different mural painting projects as well. I painted both of the Near West murals. It helps brighten up the neighborhood visually, and I think kind of spark some ideas and creativity in children. I think the sense of community and like those connections that we have with one another in the neighborhood has really shaped my life in the way of like the way I look at community and like what I expect from like community spaces and what I expect from my neighbors.
In 2011, we were looking for a place to live, and my wife's grandma and her family used to live in the Near West, so she wanted to like reconnect with her roots. The Purpose Park came as there was a house that burned down, and the debris of the house was all over the empty lot, and kids from the neighborhood came and were like playing. And we have a neighbor, his name is Danny Marquez, which he found out that there were a grant that they could activate spaces and make them green spaces. Will Marquez, the architect that designed this park, wanted to have something cool that attracted people into the space. And knowing that Washington Street was the historic national road, he thought, oh, Latinos, Mexicans have lowriders. So he thought, oh, let's put a car. And that celebrates the Latino Mexican culture, but also like families moving from one side of the country to another side. La Sardina Galleries is a small space. The main focus of this gallery is to show mainly Mexican, Latino, and minorities artists, and they will bring some of their heritage into their art pieces, but at the same time they'll add like life experiences. The artwork that we show in this space is very like family friendly, kids friendly, and is at kids eye level. So like kids can come in and check out the artwork, but it's very important for anyone to create art, be creative, because that will impact in other aspects of their life. Like anything that is a little different. When you look at something like a car standing up, your first reaction is like, cool, right? People start wondering why this car is here. And it makes them stop, makes them like start a conversation.
It is definitely a mistake today to confuse the two terms, neighborhood and community. The mobility of the population has just gotten out of hand almost. Community is a group of people that are connected on different levels, such that each member understands who these folks are and has at least the capacity to interact with them.
What makes a neighborhood a community is that you're wanted, you're valued, and you're seen. And I think that Hawthorne is like a hidden gem. And if you blink while you're driving down Washington, you'll miss it.
A neighborhood is kind of like a small town. You know, you get to know everybody. I don't have to really go out of my way to interact with my neighbors. All I got to do is just come out on my porch or walk my dog or get in my car. I'm going to see somebody.
Of course, it doesn't come without its struggles. Unfortunately, we're living in one of the communities where drug addiction is pretty heavy. When Reverend Baker started out his vision, when he's planted in this community, that is where his heart was set. And let me tell you, my biggest hope for the people of this community is to know that they have a place that they can belong, that they have a place that they can call home.
We have the ability to take care of each other. There's a lot of fear of the growth and gentrification, and I would hate to see my mom pushed out of the neighborhood because taxes are becoming unaffordable. I would hate to see, my grandmother's house also be lost. And so I do hope that we find a way to continue to allow the neighborhood to thrive with the diversity that it currently does have.
Even though it's small, this is like a very family-oriented neighborhood. I hope that as more people come in, more people will want to connect with the assets that are here, with the people that live here.
I think being a good neighbor just means you're wanting to be part of the positive things in your community. My hope is that Hawthorne continues to do what it's done for the past 100 years, just to keep that sense of community, that sense of family. Things will change over the next 100 years, and I want this neighborhood to be as good as it can be. Things might be different, but they're still the same.